Dusty Stromer showed flashes of excellence as a freshman, but has his role decreased with Gonzaga's addition of Khalif Battle and the return of Steele Venters.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Happy Thursday, and welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by FanDuel. Folks, make every moment more. Right now, new customers who will get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150 win or lose. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon today to get started. Well, folks, we are continuing our season in review series today, talking about every player on Gonzaga's roster, their season that they had last year, talking about their role next season, what that might look like, their future with the program if they have years eligibility beyond that, and then, of course, if they have an NBA future, what their professional basketball career might look like. I believe this is our fifth one in this series so far. We've had some transfer portal updates, various other things going on that have not allowed us to do these quite as much right after the season ended, but still plugging along, still chucking along through them here. And we're going to talk about Dusty Stromer on today's show. Stromer, we'll do his history here, and then we'll talk about the season that he had last year. We'll talk a little bit about what his role might look like next year, especially with some additions at the same position that he plays, and what that might look like going forward. Stromer is a 6'6" guard from Sherman Oaks, California. He visited Gonzaga way back in 2022 and ended up committing to the program in May, was enrolled the following year. There was never any mystery, never any decommits or concerns about whether he was coming to campus. He's been a Zag since 2022 and is finally able to get onto campus this past season. A highly regarded prospect in the 2023 class, as it so often happens with Gonzaga, a player that they targeted early in their high school career, secured a commitment from, and then after that, we saw that player's stock rise as they continued to get more attention on the summer circuits and just more attention in general. Gonzaga is always good at identifying those guys early enough to land them before some of those other schools come sniffing around. That was the case with Dusty Stromer. He finished his high school career 33rd in the class of 2023, according to ESPN, 44th at Rivals. On3 had him 60th, and 24/7 Sports had him 62nd. So there's a little bit of a kind of discrepancy exactly where they had him. Part of that is just that the 2023 class as a whole wasn't particularly strong. So you saw a lot more variance in how the different recruiting services kind of valued him, but overall still considered a roughly top 50 prospect, top 60 prospect by the consensus of the recruiting profiles. He played at Notre Dame High School, really talented high school program, lots of players around him who went on to the Division I ranks. Played against Bronny James a whole bunch of times in high school as well. They kind of developed a little bit of what I guess you could call a rivalry, although I think Dusty's team beat Bronny's team all 5 times that they played each other. So not really much of a rivalry, more like a dominance from Notre Dame and Dusty Stromer's program. He came into the program, the Gonzaga program, I should say, expecting to kind of grow as a developmental piece over the years. But what happened is 2 days before Gonzaga's first game of the season against Yale on November 10th, we learned that Steele Venters was going to miss the entire season with a torn ACL. A devastating setback for Steele. We'll obviously talk more about that when we do the Steele Venters episode, but also we'll talk about it a little bit later in this show when we look at what Dusty's role is going to look like next year. But what it meant was that Dusty Stromer began the season in the starting lineup. Now, he did not finish the season in the starting lineup. For those of you who listened to the Ben Gregg episode last week, you know that we basically broke up evaluating Ben Gregg's season into 2 parts. And we're going to do the same with Dusty Stromer, because that break, after that loss to Santa Clara for Gonzaga in January, was when Mark Few made the starting lineup change, moved Ben Gregg into the starting lineup, effectively shifted Anton Watson to playing more of the 3, and pushed Dusty Stromer back to the bench. And I think that break is very valuable for looking at Dusty's season as a true freshman last year. Dusty started 15 of Gonzaga's first 16 games. There was a game in the middle there against Arkansas Pine Bluff where Yo started over Stromer. It was never really clear why. I don't know if Dusty was like, I think there was a story that came out of it. Maybe Dusty was late or something along those lines. But ultimately, for the first 16 games of the season, Dusty Stromer was the starting small forward for the Gonzaga Bulldogs. In those 16 games, he averaged 28 minutes per night, 6 points, 4.1 rebounds, 1.5 assists, 1.1 turnovers, and 0.8 steals. However, Dusty was not a very efficient scorer during that period of time. In those first 16 games, Dusty shot under 40% on two-pointers. You want to be over 50. You want to be at least around 50 on those 2-point shots. To be under 40% on two-pointers, it's pretty rough. Pretty rough. He was also just 32% from the three-point line in those first 16 games. He was 87% from the free throw line, but he wasn't getting there all that much. And the Zags went 11-5 in those first 16 games. Of course, the final game being that loss to Santa Clara on the road on Steve Nash Appreciation Day or whatever the heck it was in Santa Clara on that day. But then after that, Mark Few switched the lineup, brought Dusty off the bench, brought Ben into the starting lineup. And for the final 19 games of the season, Stromer's minutes didn't actually drop that much. They did drop. He was 28 minutes per game as a starter. He was 20 minutes per game coming off the bench. So there was a drop, but it's not like he just completely fell out of the rotation. He was still a key contributor for Gonzaga night in and night out for the rest of the season. In those 20 minutes per game across those 19 games, Stromer averaged 3.8 points, 2.6 rebounds, 0.8 assists, 0.6 turnovers, and 0.5 steals. Understandably, every number fell a little bit here. That's what you would expect with the guys playing 8 less minutes per game. The efficiency did tick up, not a ton in some areas, but a lot in a critical area. His 2-point percentage, which was 39% in the first 16 games of the season, only bumped up to 41.2% in those final 19 games. Overall, that was an area of concern for Dusty Stromer. He was not a good finisher around the rim. He didn't have a lot in his bag offensively outside of the three-point shot. But in those final 19 games, that's where we saw him start to find that stroke outside. He shot 41% from three in the second half of the season. His free throw percentage dropped to 71.5%, but the sample size on that is pretty minute, so not something I'm overly concerned about. He probably wasn't going to consistently be an 87% free throw shooter. He's probably a little better than 71.5%. His overall season line was something like 75, 76. That's probably about what I would expect him to be. Actually, his overall line was 81%. Either way, he's probably going to be somewhere between that 71 and 87 on the season. Stromer scored in double figures 5 times during his first his first season as a Gonzaga Bulldog. His career high was 15 against USC. You know he loved to play against Bronny James. Like I said, he beat him a bunch of times in high school, went out. Bronny wasn't even playing in that game. He was still recovering from cardiac arrest, but Dusty showed out in Las Vegas against the Trojans of USC, 15 points, 4 of 9 from 3 in that game. He had 11 points, 5 boards, and 5 assists at San Diego in the West Coast Conference, 10 points and 3 boards against Bakersfield in the non-con, 10 points and 4 rebounds against Santa Clara in the home game for Gonzaga, the one that they won. He also had 10 points and 3 assists, including going 2 of 3 from the three-point line against McNeese in the first round of the NCAA tournament. However, Dusty definitely had his struggles offensively, particularly against better teams. He had some good games against good teams, but he had 8 games last year where he didn't score at all. 2 of those were against St. Mary's. He did not score against Purdue. He did not score against Kentucky. He did not score at Santa Clara, part of probably the reason that he got benched after that game. He also did not score against Washington. So a lot of Gonzaga's not so good games and a lot of Gonzaga's best opponents were situations where we didn't see Dusty putting the ball in the hoop. And now the question is, after this year is up, where we saw Dusty's playing time decrease from the start of the season to the end of the season, you head into his sophomore year where the Zags add another guard in Khalif Battle, where you expect Steele Venters to be back from an injury, where the player they're replacing Anton Watson with, Michael Ajayi, can play more of the 3 than maybe Watson was anticipated to. What does this all mean for Dusty heading into his sophomore season? Is this going to cost him developmental minutes? We're going to talk about that in just a second. Right after I tell you that today's episode is sponsored by Yahoo Finance. For many years, I've had my own financial spreadsheet that I've used to track all my various finances. And folks, it is so much time, it's so much effort, so much energy trying to keep up with it all. So frustrating at times. And I just remember wishing that somebody could do it for me. And then a friend of mine who's a financial advisor told me he does everything that I was trying to do simply by plugging it all into Yahoo Finance. I gave it a go and loved it. And I have been all in ever since. For more than 25 years, Yahoo Finance has been the brand behind every great investor. Whether you're a seasoned investor or just looking for some extra guidance, Yahoo Finance gives you all the tools and data that you need in one place. Securely link your brokerage accounts for a unified view of your wealth, including 401k and other investments. A comprehensive perspective is what sets apart great investors, and it's how Yahoo Finance ensures you have the insight to look at your wealth in its entirety. With a community of over 90 million users every month, their real strength is helping you on your way to financial success. For comprehensive financial news and analysis, visit the brand behind every great investor, yahoofinance.com. That is the #1 financial destination, yahoofinance.com. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast, and we're still doing our Dusty Stromer season in review episode. Talked about his past, how he ended up in at Gonzaga. We talked about his freshman season, broke it up into 2 parts: when he was a starter at the beginning of the year and when he came off the bench to finish out the season. Now we're going to look at what his role might look like next season. And I think Dusty Stromer is perhaps the player whose role is the least secure heading into next year. I have in my projections for Gonzaga's roster next year, it feels like it's effectively going to be a battle, so pun kind of intended there, a battle between Steele Venters and Dusty Stromer for that 8th rotation spot. Every year it feels like we have this conversation during the offseason. And by the way, we're only early parts of the offseason. The amount of times we're going to talk about this in June and July and August and September and October is a lot. It's going to be a lot. But every year we talk about how Mark Few is going to have a really hard time not playing 9 players. Every year we look at the roster and we think, how is Mark Few going to only play 7 or 8? And every year it's like, well, this is the year he's going to play 9. This is the year he's going to expand the rotation. It almost never happens, folks. It almost never happens. And some of that is factors outside of control. Last year, part of the reason it didn't happen was because Steele Venters suffered that injury earlier in the year or before the season really started. So there are sometimes factors outside of control. But right now, looking at Gonzaga's roster, as we always do, it's hard to look at the roster and not see how 9 players are going to play, because you have a starting 5 that is projected to be Ryan Nembhard, Nolan Hickman, Michael Ajayi, Ben Gregg, and Graham Ike. Off the bench, you have Khalif Battle, who did not come here to play off the bench, so he's going to be a rotation piece. You have Braden Huff, who looked fantastic last year as a backup center. And then you have Steele Venters and Dusty Stromer. And then you have Jun-Suk Yo, who's really going to have a hard time finding playing time because he's the 10th person right now. But if the Zags are going to play 8, which is what they typically do, and honestly, sometimes it's as few as 7, then that is going to be a challenge for Steele Venters and Dusty Stromer to carve out roles. I've said this on the show, and I will say it again here. It is possible / likely that part of Gonzaga's reasoning for adding Battle and for bringing in, Ajayi is mostly a Watson replacement, but getting Battle helps hedge their bet for one of 2 things that could happen. One, Steele Venters may not be 100% full strength on board as soon as the college basketball season starts. Remember, he tore his ACL in November. He didn't tear it in June or July. He tore it in November. The recovery here is probably not going to be in a spot where he is just full go, full steam ahead, 100%, looks exactly like the old Steele Venters to start the season. He may not be in that position. I don't have any inside information, but the people who do, the Gonzaga Bulldogs coaching staff, they went out and added a player in Khalif Battle who's probably going to play a lot of minutes at the 3 next year. That tells me that there's potentially some concern there. It is either concern about Steele Venters, or it is potential concern that Michael Ajayi is going to get some positive feedback in the NBA draft process to the point where he stays in the draft rather than coming to Gonzaga. I have said on the show multiple times that I don't think that is super likely, but again, Gonzaga is going to know more than I do. Mark Few is going to be more aware of what scouts and general managers and analysts are telling Michael Ajayi. And if they go out and add players that fit that position, it could be because they have concern about Ajayi potentially not coming to Gonzaga. I still expect Michael Ajayi will be a Zag next year, and I expect that Steele Venters will be healthy at points in the next season, although I am not super confident that Steele Venters will be 100% on opening night for the Zags. All that to say, when there is a situation where Ajayi, if Ajayi is here and Venters is fully healthy, I think Dusty Stromer's minutes are going to be fairly restricted in a way that they weren't last year. Like we said, even when he was a bench player last year, he was still playing 20 minutes per night. It's hard to see 20 minutes per night for Dusty Stromer as a sophomore if everybody is healthy and active. Again, if Ajayi leaves, boom. At that point, either Venters starts at the 3 or Battle starts at the 3, or potentially Dusty starts at the 3. All of those things are an option for Gonzaga next year. If Ajayi comes and Steele Venters is healthy, I think that Stromer and Venters are kind of fighting for that 8th spot in the rotation, and they both bring different things, so they could be utilized in different situations. If Gonzaga desperately needs to space the floor, you're going to play Steele Venters. If Gonzaga needs to grab defensive rebounds and play better perimeter defense, you're going to play Dusty Stromer. The nice thing about those guys competing for a spot is that they offer different things, so they can be mixed and matched. And what I would like to see from Mark Few, if they're willing to do this, and they haven't always been, he's fairly rigid with his rotations, but in a situation where everybody is healthy and active and playing, that both these guys are getting a decent run game in and game out, but that it is sometimes fluctuating depending on the matchup. There might be a game where Dusty Stromer plays 18 minutes and Steele Venters plays 7. And then the next game, it might be flipped, and Steele plays 7 minutes and Dusty plays 18. Like that, I think that is a realistic outcome for Gonzaga this upcoming season. And I would love to see Mark Few be willing to play 9 guys night in and night out, run and run and run and run, and just be out in transition, wearing the opposing team down, because you're willing to play more of your depth than many other teams are, because you have it. Because you have the depth to do so, and you can have Ryan Nembhard constantly pushing the pace, because if he needs a break, you can slide Nolan Hickman down to the 1, you can play Battle at the 2, you can play Steele and Dusty at the 3. Like, you have plenty of options to be able to fill those spots. That's what I would love to see. I'm not confident we will see that necessarily. Mark Few hasn't always been willing to play a deeper rotation and just kind of push the pace a little bit more, but I do think it works with this team, again, assuming everybody is healthy. For Dusty, the things that would help him play more next year, he needs more versatility offensively. He's a strong defensive player, but he needs to be more than just a corner 3-point shooter. That's really all he was able to show offensively as the year went on. He showed occasional flashes of being able to, take a defender who comes out, who closes out too hard, drive on the closeout, make a pass. I remember a play against Portland in particular where he attacked a closeout and drove to the basket, was up in the air, made a little dish to Braden Huff for a lay-in. That kind of stuff we need more of. We saw very little of it last year. He didn't have a lot of opportunities to do it, but it's also not something that he has developed all that much. We haven't seen much of a floater game from Dusty Stromer. Dusty Stromer is very, very lanky and skinny. Obviously, I think this is probably the biggest thing that needs to change for Dusty Stromer is he needs to get stronger. He needs to put on more muscle. The coaching staff is already saying this. I believe it was on Dan Dickow's podcast where Brian Michelson or Stephen Gentry, one of them, was on the show and basically said the same thing. Like, Dusty needs to put on weight. He needs to get stronger. And I don't think that's a secret for anybody. He was really stick skinny last year. Most freshmen are. As you develop into your body, as you get into a college regimen of weight training and strength training and working with that staff, you're going to get stronger. He needs to be able to do that without sacrificing speed and athleticism and jumping ability and all that stuff. That's not easy to do, but it is something we see players go through between freshman and sophomore year. If Dusty can get stronger, ideally that allows him to finish through contact so that he can get to the free throw line, convert there where he's a strong free throw shooter, and just be a more dynamic offensive player. But also add that floater game to your game. Watch tape of Julian Strother, who had a phenomenal floater. Watch Kevin Pangos, who had a phenomenal floater. Gonzaga has had a lot of success with that floater historically. Mark Few likes that shot. For Dusty Stromer, because he's not going to put on 40 pounds of muscle and all of a sudden be just like a wrecking ball. But if he puts on a little bit of weight, he might be able to attack certain players at the rim. But if you're going up against the big boys, you want to be able to have a little bit of a floater game that you can use to get over those defenders without having to constantly try to just bully your way to the free throw line. So I think if Dusty can add that stuff to his bag offensively, we also want to see him be a bit more of a facilitator. He's not a great passer last year. And he wasn't asked to be. That wasn't really his role, but it's more offensive versatility allows him to play in different situations. Steele Venters is a better offensive player than Dusty Stromer right now. There's not really any debate about that. I think Dusty's a better defensive player. And I think that especially last year with Dusty now getting a year of experience playing defense in Gonzaga's system, something Steele Venters does not have, Dusty should unquestionably be the better defensive player for Gonzaga next year. He's probably going to be a better rebounder as well. But Steele's a better three-point shooter, and he has more versatility to his game offensively. That allows Gonzaga to mix and match the matchups. But if Stromer can develop offensively, he's not going to probably be as consistent of a three-point shooter as Steele Venters. He's just a very, very good three-point shooter. But if Dusty can add more of that versatility to his game offensively, that's going to force Mark Few's hand a little bit of like, hey, at this point, there's very little that Steele's doing better than Dusty. And if that becomes the situation, then that allows Gonzaga to play Dusty Stromer in those situations more consistently without having to worry about constantly mixing and matching the matchups. I believe Dusty can take those steps. I still think that the best basketball is ahead of him, maybe even beyond this upcoming season, but there are things he can do between now and November and between November and March that allow him to play a bigger role than what is currently looking like on paper. Because right now it's kind of looking like he's going to be a fringe rotation player, and that's unusual for a guy who played 20 plus minutes per game last year. But Dusty definitely has the ball in his court to make some improvements this year and put himself in a position where he is playing a consistent role for Gonzaga next season. And what does that mean for his future? Because after this upcoming season, there's going to be a whole lot of guys out the door. There's not a whole lot of returners for Gonzaga in the 25-26 season. Dusty Stromer could not only be a starter in year 3, but he could be really knocking on the door of putting himself in the NBA draft conversation. And we're going to talk about all of that in just a second. Right after I tell you about today's sponsor, FanDuel. Folks, it is playoff time in the NBA and the NHL. Baseball is in full swing, and FanDuel is your place to bet on every single game. Right now, new customers will get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150 win or lose. So bet on everything from slap shots to home runs to slam dunks, all on an app that is safe, secure, and super easy to use. And folks, at the conclusion of the college basketball NCAA tournament, Gonzaga opened at plus 3,000 odds to win the 2025 national championship. They are already down to plus 1,800. At this point, you better maximize your profit by tossing that money down on the Zags right now. If you are feeling confident about this 24-25 team, then what are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet an automatic W. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, folks, closing out the show today, continuing our season in review episode talking about Dusty Stromer. We talked about his high school career, how he ended up in Spokane. We talked about his freshman season, broke it up into 2 parts, the time as a starter, the time as a reserve. We then talked about what his role might look like next season and what he can do to improve his chances of being a more consistent rotation player for Mark Few in the 2024-25 season. What about the future? Because next year's Dusty Stromer's sophomore year. He's got 2 years of eligibility after that. And Stromer has always kind of looked like a 3 to 4 year guy. And in an era where 3 to 4 year players at the same university are a bit more rare, it's nice to see Dusty back for year 2. And people, I've used this term a lot. If you're on the Discord channel, you see me post it. People like to use the transfer portal and NIL as kind of a boogeyman of like anytime a player leaves the program, doesn't commit to the program, we didn't give him enough money. Kids don't want to wait, blah, 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 whatever. And I would caution that for Gonzaga, this really hasn't been a tremendous issue. People say, players don't want to stick around for 3 or 4 years. Like Nolan Hickman's about to start his 4th season at Gonzaga, and he's been a starter for 3 of them. Ben Gregg is about to start his 4th season at Gonzaga. He's been here for multiple years. Like Gonzaga has developed multiple pieces who have been in the Anton Watson just left after being here for 5 years. Like Gonzaga's doing this at a pretty high level. So the idea that Dusty Stromer, he won't stick around, players in this era aren't doing that. It's just not true. It's just not true. That doesn't mean I can say with absolute 100% confidence Dusty Stromer is going to be here for 4 years. I have no idea. There's a scenario where this next season, Steele Venters is healthy. Michael Ajayi doesn't stay in the NBA draft process. Dusty Stromer's minutes are cut in half from what he played last year. And throughout the season, he just never really cracks the rotation. He transfers. I don't think that's a likely situation, but it is a possible outcome. But the cupboard for Gonzaga after this upcoming season is pretty bare. Michael Ajayi will be gone. He will not be back. Even if he plays this year at Gonzaga, it will be his last year in a college basketball uniform. Ben Gregg will be gone after this upcoming season. Khalif Battle will be gone. Nolan Hickman will be gone. Ryan Nembhard will be gone. Every one of those players is about to play their final season of college basketball next year. That means that the best case scenario for current players on Gonzaga's roster to be on the roster after this season includes Dusty Stromer, Braden Huff, Graham Ike, Steele Venters, and Jun Sukyo. Out of that group, Dusty's going to play a big role. Now, of course, Gonzaga is going to make additions. They're already pursuing players in the 2025 recruiting class, including Isaiah Harwell, who would probably be a day one starter as a true freshman. Obviously, they're going to pursue the transfer portal to fill some of those spots that are left by their entire guard room and half of their front court leaving as well. So I think Gonzaga's roster is going to look a lot different in 2025-26. But I have a feeling Dusty Stromer is a part of that plan. And I think that that's what is being sold to him right now. Because the coaching staff certainly talked to Dusty when they went out and got Khalif Battle. Obviously, he was on campus, so Dusty would have known that this was happening. And we've heard stories in the past where when Gonzaga pursued Ryan Nembhard, they spoke to Nolan Hickman ahead of time. When Gonzaga pursued Andrew Nembhard, they spoke to Jalen Suggs ahead of time. With Gonzaga pursuing Khalif Battle and the expectation that it's going to impact the minutes for Dusty Stromer and Steele Venters and Michael Ajayi for that matter, those players had conversations with the coaching staff ahead of time. This is not an unknown thing. And I think for Dusty, part of that conversation is, hey, we still envision you as a part of the team for 24-25. Like, you're still going to be a piece. You're still going to play a role. Here are the things we want you to work on, et cetera, et cetera. But also, your junior year in 25-26, we want you to be a day one starter, big time contributor, 30-minute per game guy. I believe that that is the conversation that is being had with Dusty Stromer right now. And if he buys in, he could step right into that starting role. Venters and him could both start if they both returned at the 2 and the 3, if they wanted to do it that way. And he could be a really, really big piece for Gonzaga. And then beyond that, starting at the 3 for Gonzaga, you're going to get NBA looks. Like, you're absolutely going to get NBA looks. Top 50 prospect coming out of high school, 4-star recruit, played at a prominent high school, had good success there, develops for a couple of years as a bench player, rotation piece for Gonzaga, blossoms into a starter in year 3. Like, that's a storyline that gets you in the NBA. It's a Corey Kispert storyline. I mean, Corey spent 4 years at Gonzaga. Maybe Dusty will do that as well. I wouldn't be surprised if he does. And then that leads to the NBA. It's a Julian Strawther storyline. Top 50 recruit, didn't play much early in his career, blossomed as a starter in year 3, went to the NBA. I mean, it's a storyline that has happened at Gonzaga multiple times recently. So there's no reason to. Rui Hachimura, obviously different because of the international element of things, but didn't play much early in his career, blossomed into a starter in year 3, was a lottery pick. Like, these things happen at Gonzaga with a pretty consistent regularity. So for Dusty Stromer, you get stronger, you get more physical, you put some weight on yourself, you get more dynamic as a scorer outside of just the corner 3-point shooting, more consistent from the perimeter, as well as adding, some of that utter versatility to his bag. Dusty Stromer is not going to be an NBA player because of his rim pressure or his floater or anything like that. He's going to be an NBA player because of his defense and 3-point shooting. The same reason that Julian Strawther is an NBA player. I was going to say the same reason as Corey Kispert, although the defense isn't really a factor for him. The same reason, if Anton Watson makes it, it'll be because of those two things. It'll be because he's demonstrated consistency enough as an outside shooter that a team's going to take a chance on him. Dusty needs to improve in those areas. Fortunately for Dusty, his 2 biggest strengths right now are his defense and his 3-point shooting. He's 6'6". He's the right size to be a guard in the NBA. He has the requisite skills are developing for him right now. He's not there yet. If Dusty, he can't, for the record, but if Dusty Stromer right now were to try to go in the NBA, he would get bodied. It would not work. That's not to say he's not skilled enough. He's just not strong enough. He's not mature enough. But the skills that he has are the right skills for him to be a role player in the NBA. And he just needs an opportunity to continue to refine them, to continue to hone them, and then to showcase them on a national stage. This is why I think the developmental process for Dusty is kind of working perfectly, not just for Gonzaga, but for him. having him as a eighth, ninth player on this upcoming season is not a knock on Dusty at all. It is a testament to how deep and talented this roster is. I've said on the show that I will take Gonzaga's top 9 against just about any team in the country. The only team at the time I was kind of unwilling to put them up against was Kansas, and we just found out that Riley Kugel, Florida transfer, is not going to go to Kansas. Gonzaga's right there with Kansas. They're right there with Houston and Iowa State and some of those other top programs in the country. And that's in part because their 8th, 9th guy is Dusty Stromer, who's really good. And I think if he develops another year where we see him getting a little bit more consistent as a three-point shooter, a little bit more consistent, not committing stupid fouls. That was something that was an issue for him last year. It's an issue for most freshmen. It's not an overly concerning thing, but he gets a little bit more disciplined defensively. He gets a little bit stronger, a little bit more physical. He's a better perimeter defender, just continues to improve in that area. He can shoot threes from more than just the corner, and he starts to showcase a little bit more versatility offensively. If we see gradual improvements in those areas as a sophomore, and then he steps into a starting role as a small forward as a junior, and he's refined all of those skills, and he's more confident and more consistent with the flow of Gonzaga's offense, he could be a guy who everybody in the country in 25, 26 is like, where did this kid come from? How does Gonzaga have another guy like this? And believe me, let me tell you right now, if Dusty Stromer explodes as a junior and he's still got the baby face and he's still got the long flowing blonde hair, he is going to be passionately disliked by people who watch Gonzaga basketball, who hate watch them, by St. Mary's fans, by other WCC fans, by UCLA fans, whomever. They're going to watch Dusty Stromer as a junior who's going to have seemingly come out of nowhere, who's having this dominant season. And they're going to be like, how the hell does Gonzaga continue to do this? It's because they get guys to buy into the system. It's because a player like Dusty Stromer doesn't transfer after his freshman year, despite knowing that his playing time is going to probably not increase and maybe decrease as a sophomore. It's because you get those guys to buy in. Gonzaga is so good at this. And in an era where it's harder than ever, the fact that Dusty Stromer is still here, the fact that he could be a developmental piece who blows up as a junior or a senior is a testament to what this staff is really, really good at. And that being at the top tier in that area in player development is why they are able to have this kind of success, even in an era where players are less likely to stick around long-term. It's going to wrap it up for us today here on the Locked On Zags podcast. Thank you so much to those of you who have made this show your first listen or your first watch of the day. We'll be back on Friday rounding up some news and notes around the Gonzaga basketball landscape. We'll talk a little Zag baseball as well, and then we'll be back next week, keeping you up to date on any transfer portal news, NBA G League Combine information for Anton Watson as well. And of course, we'll continue our player in review series as well. Thanks again, and until next time, as always, go Zags.